G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week. Now today, as always, we do have a lot to go over. Of course, we need to look at the massive missile and drone attacks towards Ukraine yesterday. Not only was it massive, but it's actually been the biggest one so far in this war. We need to look at some attacks in other areas on the front, some HIMARS, of course. Then we'll link all that in with the maps and where we are seeing them move. Particularly, we'll look in the north at some Ukrainian advancement, and then we need to look at Pokrovsk, Avdiivka, at where that front line is then falling. And then I want to speak at length about escalation, red lines, and nuclear response and doctrine there as well, as I think there is some difference in maybe where some people are feeling like red lines are and what is said that has been crossed. So we'll speak at length about this and responses and how the US and how Washington then may view this. Now, one thing I do want to say is I will most likely miss a video tomorrow. If things really go down, I will get one out, but I'm flying interstate and back in the day. Australia's a very large country, so it's taking a while. And I'm giving a closed 3-hour presentation about topics we speak about in these videos and some other bits and pieces as well. So I'll let you know how that goes, but I won't share it publicly anyway. So look, let's talk about these strikes. Now, yesterday, there was a massive drone and missile attack against Ukraine. Not just large, but actually the largest so far. Now, in yesterday's video, because there's time between the research, filming, editing, and upload, I did say that it seems like there may be some build-up, maybe as a revenge for Kursk, maybe to strike Ukraine's remaining energy systems as well. And this actually did occur just by chance on that day, and it did consist of Ukraine saying 236 missiles and drones. Now, this was done in daylight, so we presume it was done also to be seen. Now, as I'm filming this right now, there are reports coming in that Russian bombers are in the air again. Now, let's talk about this. So, this is what we are getting now on the Air Raid app for Ukraine, that many regions have gone red, and it is saying that MiG-31s are in the air, potentially with the Kinzhal, the somewhat hypersonic missiles had actually been launched. Now, before we look in depth at the strikes yesterday, one thing I want to say, firstly, anyone celebrating civilian casualties caught up in anything, whether it is in Ukraine, whether it is in Russia, whether it is anywhere, is completely disgusting. But when we look at this attack, I honestly think the media and officials and bloggers who reported well over 2 years ago that Russia was running out or was out of missiles, they owe the citizens of Ukraine an apology. They knew it was bullshit, or they were believing their own Kool-Aid. And now that we are in the 3rd year of this war, and Russia not only is being able to maintain these attacks, they're increasing the lethality and the amount of munitions involved in these attacks as well. So let's have a look at where some of these then went. So this is one of these location maps that show where a lot of these went, and you can see where the drones and the missiles were targeting. Now, a lot of these are towards Kyiv and into the west of Ukraine as well, but really everywhere lit up yesterday with massive attacks. Now, let's look at what Ukraine say the interception rate was. Now, as you know, if you've been watching my channel for a while, I am always very skeptical, I guess, of these numbers here given. Sometimes it doesn't line up with what we are seeing, but it gives somewhat of an idea. So, 30% of the Kinzhals, then the Iskanders, 1 of 6 were hit, then all of the KH-22s, the majority of the Kaliber KH-59-69s, and the majority of the Shahid drones. That is what Ukraine is claiming that had been intercepted and downed. Now, an interesting thing was we saw that many of these Kaliber missiles were fired from the Black Sea, from missile carriers there. And this is a video of them being launched from the naval vessels. There's another vessel there to the right of this footage too. This does go against the idea that Russia has no remaining power in the Black Sea, as the Black Sea fleet has been obliterated, had to be moved by those seaborne drones. That, well, they're still able to have these out there. Yes, we have seen large losses against the Black Sea fleet, but still out there able to then launch those caliber missiles as well. So let's have a look at a little bit more footage. Here is the Kyiv hydroelectric power plant here. Now, what we can see on fire here is said to be one of the electricity generating generators, not that the dam wall itself, of course, it sits right in the center of Kyiv, that has no like structural damage, that the dam itself is not jeopardized to have a collapse, because that would be absolutely catastrophic. But the ability to generate power has been badly damaged here also. So that is what I am hearing and seeing. Then we have some footage of a ground. This is an analog of a Iranian Shaheed, then hitting in here too. I don't have confirmation on what that was, but we do have some footage of some of these coming down too. So this is very impressive here. 50 cal on the back of one of these mobile air units as well, that we know have been very effective against drones. He's lighting up the M2 and then has actually struck, said to be a cruise missile, with one of these rounds here. So very impressive shooting on that. I've seen some people calling that out for being a fake. Whatever, it's impressive footage coming up. And a KH-101 here, as I've put for submarine hunting. This looks like on a dam wall somewhere. You can hear firing, and then splats into the ground. Into the water there, obviously missing its target. But what I will say is the actual damage assessment of these strikes, it is impossible to know. As we know, there are very strict laws in place. If you film any of these, expect a knock on the door and to be arrested, or apology video. We have seen that previously. We've also seen the Russian FSB do that with people filming convoys in Kursk as well. We know the SBU had those apology videos from people who filmed some of the BDA, the battle damage assessment as well. But what we do know is Zelensky has said that there is significant damage to infrastructure and reports of power outages and damage to water infrastructure all across Ukraine. Zelensky has also called for more aid and the ability to use long-range missiles inside of Russia. But what I do say, and I've said this before, is the existing platforms that Ukraine has, the Storm Shadow Scalp ATACMS, these will be somewhat basically ineffective against these Russian bombers. You really want to hit those bombers on the ground, especially with those systems. They can't intercept them in the air, but they are based well outside of the range of those existing systems. Now, speaking of that, at the same time that attack was launched last night, in the day, we actually saw Ukraine had drones in the air at the same time attacking some of the bases of where these long-range bombers were, with the footage coming out of one of them missing, a UJ-26 Boba Ukrainian drone here, then actually striking into a residential building, causing a fair bit of damage to at least, say, 3 to 4 stories of this building. I don't know how many people were injured or killed, if any, in this. I should also add, with the strikes yesterday into Ukraine, it said that 7 people have been killed. That number may increase. We see this footage of that drone here. Now, that drone likely is more set and forget, may have been jammed, may not take into account things on the ground going for that angles to base, and has hit then that residential building. And what I'm talking about here to tie this together, so this is where angles is around about 10 or 15 k's either way. It's not going to matter for what we're showing. And this is area, say, near where, because a lot of this is occupied down through here. So let's say, we're talking 600 or more kilometers for those systems. Those Storm Shadow Scalp ATACMS of open source ranges are not going to have an effect against these, even if Ukraine is able to use them. The messaging, I understand, but to say they're going to hit these is not realistic. Even if they can go in, they're traveling so far, so long, and at so few numbers, the idea of interception by air defense is probably highly more likely than actually just mass swarms of drones, and knowing some of those are going to be just sacrificial and then striking them on the ground too. But of course, then the drones are slower. It's a really hard thing to look at. What is Ukraine what has Ukraine got? What may they get? And what effect for these bombers is there realistically? So that's an interesting one to then look at. Now, I do think that these strikes may have been more effective than previous strikes, as we do know that Patriots are working and have been allocated up to protect Ukraine's offensive into Kursk as well. So of course, you have a finite amount of these, it means that other areas are not going to be covered with that same air defense. Now, air defense too, of course, has a finite amount of interceptors, whether it is bullets or missiles aboard it, and of course is very expensive also. That's why in the very beginning I touched on that there is reports that bombers are in the air again. There is air raids across Ukraine that we don't know, but with those striking, say, ballistic missiles, those systems, we don't know if the magazines on those are empty or low. If these strikes, if Russia can continue strikes in the coming days or weeks, they may be then more effective again. Now, the reason I bring up this thing in angles of the apartment here being hit was it does seem that when these came in, the bombers were already in the air about to attack Ukraine. So I guess it's some bad timing on this. Now, Poland has also said that a drone did enter its airspace. Now, this is from Reuters here. So a drone likely entered its airspace on Monday from the Russian bombardment. A spokesman for the Polish army said most likely it was a drone, that we assume so because the trajectory of the flight and speed indicate it was definitely not a missile. But he said it was impossible to say whether the object was Russian or Ukrainian as weather conditions had not allowed for visual identification. So then because of these weather conditions, it then wasn't intercepted either. Due to prevailing weather conditions, it was impossible to clearly identify it, which prevented the decision to shoot it down. This, I don't get why, if it was Ukrainian or Russian, if it was a drone, it doesn't matter. I don't see why Poland wouldn't shoot it down regardless, because we'd have seen right here, Poland had been on high alert entering its airspace since a stray Ukrainian missile struck the Polish village here, killing 2 people in 2022. So regardless of whose it is, if it's in the airspace, I think Poland should probably go, well, it could be a stray, it could be, coming somewhere, let's shoot it down. This down here has never been formally accepted by Ukraine. I know I've touched on this and I've touched on a lot of polls at this event here actually changed their opinion on the war massively overall. Now, the psychological effect of these strikes should never be understated, let alone the infrastructure loss, the loss of energy, potentially even running water in some areas, and how that has huge effects on people psychologically, morale, everything across the entire country, as of course we're seeing more strikes now out even into the west of Ukraine. And this can massively affect people and how they're feeling towards the war, or may choose to uplift and actually move to the EU, having more effects then on Ukraine's economy. Now, the reason I bring this up is it can of course have a shift on how people may see the idea potentially of negotiations. Now, attacks like this, absolutely, if we look at 9/11, we look at the Blitz, we look at whatever, these can absolutely unify a country, as we have seen in Ukraine as well with the strikes. But prolonged like this and it continuing on, and especially if it is increasing, this can actually de-unify as well, especially when there is no end in sight. There is no end to this war in sight. The amount of bombers that are being intercepted and downed is very, very few realistically. It's 1 or 2. There's as many coming down from mechanical failures as there is from being struck, if not more. There's no end in sight for this. There's still potentially years to come. And I do ask what the psychological effect on those civilians living in Ukraine under this actually is, and how much air defense may be allocated from the West to try and have some effect on this overall. But one thing that air defense has shown, traditional air defense may be really good against missiles, but drones in just mass numbers is a huge concern for every military moving forward. We can see this in Israel, we can see this in Ukraine, we can see this in Russia with those drones coming into even Moscow and areas like that, some of the most defended areas in the world. Look at Tel Aviv, a drone come in there. So that is something where we'll see large leaps and bounds in the future for defense against those drones. So let's look at the maps. We'll look at where things are moving, and then I want to talk about red lines, escalation, and of course the movement into Kursk, because I think it's a little bit off in some areas. Let me show, I can't show you this footage, but it'll be on the Telegram if you'd like to see. So we can see this is a Russian training area here. We can see guys standing around. We can see some vehicles as well. And 2 HIMARS hit this. Funnily, these actually are not airburst, and it does look like all these soldiers do actually manage to get to some cover from this, but there would still be large casualties in something like this. We'll see if anything comes off the ground, but again, I can't show you that. So where I want to talk about is Avdiivka. So here's Ukraine, the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Of course, the red check ground that Russia has made in the past 24 hours. The blue is ground Ukraine has taken either back or taken within 2 weeks, and green is over 2 weeks, except for it's incorrect up in Kursk, because this ground is now over 2 weeks old. Some of this, the majority of this, actually should be green at this point. But let's come down into Avdiivka, and what you can see straight away is there are large advancements into here, and of course the defensive works that sit between Mykolaiivka, Memrik, as well, like we've shown you, these are quickly actually coming under control as course more advancement out towards Pokrovsk, and this movement through Novohorodka. This is where I've shown you over the past couple of days of the Russian infantry working. Many are saying that this has come completely under Russian control. This is a town of about 14,000 people. This is actually a major town in here. When we even compare, say, Suja, it is a larger town than that as well. Of course, different areas have been on the front for a lot longer, but just to give you an idea, and as we can see, the remainder of then said to be the trap down in here has come under Russian control around these reservoirs, of course, and Kalinovi. So there is large advancement around this area today. Now, let's look on the Noel reports map here. Now, he is showing just as much movement in and around to a degree, maybe as yesterday around these reservoirs, but what we can 100% say is we do know from that there has been mass movement in here as well. And then we have the map here from Syriac. Now, what we can see is similar directions of things moving. Let me line this up better. So here in Mykolaiivka, we can see a push into here, less on the Syriac map than Deep State is showing. So when it's Ukraine's map showing Russian gain, if it's over, then this map, I'd probably say it's more so than this, if that makes sense. So you can see like this, it might be like a quarry or something here. By this map has come fully under control, and showing more of a push down to Memrik as well, and even more somewhat around these reservoirs, but maybe less around Novohorodka as well, where we saw that infantry working, and maybe more of a push out towards Horovka as well. So what we can see, so he's saying most 40% under control. Yeah, so maybe similar here, maybe zoomed out on the map, it looks a little bit different, but is still large advancements in there of incredibly heavily defended areas with a lot of defensive works. But there's really one main defensive line coming between Pokrovsk. It'd be very interesting to see how this then all lines up with the further push then through. So let's move and see the next update here is this New York Toretsk front. This map is still showing here, like we saw Noel reports, that there is Ukrainian troops stuck here, surrounded in New York. Again, not exactly sure now. That's been a week, a little bit like the Russian troops in Volchansk. They say is the disconnect. This has been like a month and a half. I don't know exactly what the situation is in there, but you can see by today's map a fill-in between sort of Zalizne up to their Toretsk front in here. There's footage of an M2 Bradley fighting and firing around here too, but you need to understand that Bradley firing those positions is firing on Ukrainian positions they held only a few weeks ago as well. We presume that the positions in here are very hardened. This blue, I can't talk, this purple in here has held for some 10 years. These are important areas that have ground down. Even if in square kilometers it's not that much, in warfare that's not relevant. It is relevant, but it can be, it's not as relevant in the attritional phase of a war compared to the maneuver phase of this. So let's look in here. Let's look at Syriac's map. Now, what he's showing, you look, it's basically the same amount in the same area. Now, he's not showing the grey zone push right down into here, but regardless, again, very, very similar. But he's showing from Zalizne more of a push up into the western side of Toretsk as well. Now, let's have a look on the Noel Reports' map. Now, he's showing way more of a fill-in around this reservoir down in here, not this grey zone, and very similar he's sort of halfway between Syriac and Deep State when it comes to in terms of Pivnechny and Zalizny as well. So we do know that this is pushing. As I said, there has been some presence near the memorial here, but it's not shown there. So we will definitely then continue to look at what is happening in here. Now, on this map today, this is not the only update. Now, we haven't seen this move in here, but apparently this was actually opportune for Ukraine to push and take this, because some troops from Russia did actually move out of here to reinforce Kursk, and Ukraine took the initiative and took back that. But we can see near Pishani as well that by this map, Russia has taken another piece of ground in here. Now we know this area here looks significantly different. When we look at the Syriac, it's looking something more like this. Again, it's difficult to know, but this map is showing there was some Russian advancement there. Now, up in the north, and I'm edging you on this, but this has shown then no update for, that's 22nd, we saw some on the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. No real change in here for at least 3 days via this map. Let's look on to the Noel reports. Now, what he is showing is this area in here has then filled in. Now, he's showing this on today, but we have seen both Syriac and Deep State have actually shown, and Warmapper showed that this was filled in maybe 2 or 3 days ago. So so Noel is confirming this today, but some of these maps did show it the other day. So whether it was a today advancement or enough footage and stuff for him to update it, we're not too sure. We still know there is a lot of localized fighting in Kotonovo, then around pushing into this, I'll call this sort of the Glashkovo front in here, and then a lot coming out as well in the east. But then let's look at what Syriac is saying, as he's showing that then Russia has made back some ground. So we're going to jump onto this map because having the satellite imagery makes it just a little bit easier for us to line up some bits and pieces. So if we look at then where Kotonovo is up in here and where this grey zone is, Syriac, he is saying that Russia has regained some of the territory up in here. They've recaptured these localities and re-entered this locality where clash with Ukrainian forces are taking place, as well as correcting some areas under control. So he's saying that there is some Russian pushback in here and recapturing some areas. Now, we need to speak about the north at length, and I want to speak about the idea of red lines being crossed, escalation, Washington not knowing, and we've said that it's Ukraine sort of, if they didn't tell the West about this, it was a bit of better ask for forgiveness than permission here. So let's look at this FT article, Financial Times article, and have a read of this. I think this brings up some good points that we have spoken about, and I want to add my 2 cents on here and some other things that I've had a quick look at as well. So with its Kursk offensive, Ukraine not only crossed Russia's borders, it also crossed red lines set in Washington. The US have insisted that its goal to help Ukraine defend its territory and survive as a sovereign state. Any suggestion that the war could be taken into Russia has been regarded as dangerous. Now, with this crossing into here, we have seen Zelensky say and denounce that these naive, illusionary concept of so-called red lines regarding Russia, which dominated the assessment of the war by some partners, and he says that that view has now crumbled, that there would be some massive escalation if this then occurred. But I want to talk about this escalation in a second and what the doctrine actually says. But has it? The difference between caution in Washington and risk-taking in Kyiv reflects not just a difference in analysis, but how far Vladimir Putin can be pushed. It is also a reflection of subtle differences in war aims. At the start of the conflict, President Joe Biden set his administration 2 goals. The first was to support Ukraine, but the second was to avoid World War III. If forced to choose between the 2 aims, the US would clearly choose the latter. And you and I have spoken at length about this. We've also done some sort of think tanks on the Telegram as well. And there's also some professors who have spoken about if there was some nuclear strike in Ukraine, how would the US respond? Would they respond in nuclear? Probably not, because the overall globe there, that's absolutely devastating for everything. Conventional strikes, possibly so, but what would actually happen if that occurred? Now, of course, Ukraine is defending themselves and their nation there. The US, they need to have much zoomed out vision of this happening. The US being the most powerful country in the world militarily and economically, they can't just push everything else aside to look into what is the best for Ukraine's defense either. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I'm saying that Ukraine needs to have a very local vision of, okay, this is what's going on, this war right here. The US, being the behemoth it is, trying to maintain power in a becoming multipolar world, needs to zoom out and go, right, how does X affect this? How does the oil affect blah? What would happen if this strike went there? And it's very interesting to think about what would actually be the US response if there was a nuclear strike within Ukraine. And it's also an interesting mental exercise to look at what would happen if Russia actually launched a nuke in Kursk, in their own territory. What would happen there? Now, these nuke strikes, it's not going to happen because we will talk about the doctrine on this. But Ukraine is fighting for its survival. It would accept direct US involvement in a war with Russia. So if US wanted to go, they'd go. Of course, they'd take any of that. According to a recent book by David Sanger, Biden even suggests to his aides that Zelensky might be deliberately trying to draw America into a third world war. And we have spoken about this with potential false flags, with some messaging. Ukraine may try, if things get really, really bad at the front lines and things aren't looking great now, that there may be an attempt to try and get NATO more involved, boots on the ground, or more weapons systems there as well. We have seen that Russia may do the same in the other to discredit Ukraine, to stop maybe those partners coming in, maybe stop support, or maybe to draw in another party as well. Now, this continues. As a result, there is a different appetite for risk in Washington and Kyiv. The US has been consistently cautious about the types of weapons it supplies to Ukraine. I'm talking about these long-range systems here. These prohibitions are still in place, although the Ukrainians are pushing hard for them to be lifted. The difference in tolerance for risk between America and Ukraine is reflected within Europe. Of course, geographically. Countries that are close to the front line feel directly threatened by Russia, such as Estonia and Poland. They've pushed to give Ukraine more advanced weapons and more latitude to use them. Germany has consistently been much slower to act. Now, at the end of the day, the safety within Europe is due to the nuclear umbrella of the US. Same in Australia. Australia can have the position on topics around the world outwardly towards China or Russia or whoever because of the umbrella of the US. And, of course, then NATO, but the main firepower within NATO is the US and its nuclear weapons and the deterrence that those give. This is one of the things you see in NATO. As one country is seen as the same as another, you can see like Estonia being very outspoken, knowing, or Latvia or Lithuania, where you're like, yeah, but realistically you are powerful because of the thing you're in, which is, the whole point of NATO, but they can see things much differently to what the country of being like, we're the ones that are going to have to make that act. And Kissinger actually speaks about this in this. The principal element of Europe's defence, the objective of European policy, was primarily psychological, is to oblige the US to treat Europe as an extension of itself in case of emergency. And that is where Europeans see this. This is what you've seen ex-administrations talking about of Europe or NATO. They need to also push in X amount of their GDP into defence too. It can't just be, we've got you guys. Who cares? Both the Ukrainian and US governments say that the Biden administration was not informed of the Kursk offensive before it took place, although it is clearly in America's interest to deny direct involvement in planning an attack on Russian soil. That seems to be true. People are saying it seems to be true here that the US didn't know, but we do know there was a lot of satellite imagery and ISR given to Ukraine about build-ups and areas here too, but did they actually know the plan? Potentially not. With the Kursk offensive, the Ukrainians have taken a leaf out of Israel's book by taking military action that has not been approved in Washington. The assumption by both Ukraine and Israel is that if the action is successful, it will receive retrospective approval by America. Kursk has had this. If it fails, the US will ultimately help them deal with the consequences. So if this does fail in Kursk, then will the US cut off? No. If they need more to have it, will they help deal with the consequences? Yes. So sort of tying, I guess, the US up a little bit in here. The US is just not going to step away. And I know this annoys a lot of Americans being like, why are we got our fingers in every pie around the world? My answer to that is, if you want to maintain the power and influence around the world, you have to do that. Same with NATO, the EU. If America was to pull out of NATO and not have that influence in in Europe, in the EU. Of course, America's not an EU country, but it has a lot of influence there, militarily being the NATO umbrella. Then the US loses then that extension of itself within Europe, and Europe could be threatened by becoming more, I guess, controlled by Asia, at least economically, over time as well. We don't know how the world will shift. America needs influence. It could just be then basically a sovereign island sitting, of course, North America, if it can't have those arms reaching out, even if, of course, that the pressure on the taxpayer can be a lot higher. The US knows that Putin has publicly threatened to use nuclear weapons and that Russia has consistently practiced their use in military exercises. In 2022, US intelligence intercepts pickups frequent and sometimes detailed conversation between Russian military officials. It is possible that some of these conversations were intended to be overheard. This is very common in intelligence active measures, is to have pieces found or are being listened into as part of false information, misinformation campaigns as well. If you read any spy books, that is not then uncommon. The public threats, private chat, are seriously enough for Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, to warn Russia of catastrophic consequences should it go nuclear. We've heard about conventional strikes against Russian facilities if that were to occur. America's pointed out the warning to Sullivan to refute the idea they simply folded in the face of Russian threats. Rather than respecting Russia's red lines, the US analysts have gradually tiptoed over them, and we can see the escalation ladder slowly then climbing up, or tiptoe as they say. Some Western analysts believe the Kursk offensive has now decisively debunked Putin's nuclear threats. I disagree with this. It has always been assumed invading Russia has always been assumed a red line of nuclear weapons usage, and the Ukrainians are marching right across it. Now, this is what I disagree with. Russia's nuclear red line for attack into Russia is not just the border. If you actually have a look at it then here, the response to any use of nuclear weapon, very similar to us, in defense, us, I mean the West, but the aggression, as well as the event of aggression against the Russian Federation with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is in jeopardy. Against a critical government, military sites, Russian Federation, disruption would undermine nuclear forces, so if it undermined that. But what we need to look at is number D, that conventional weapons when the existence of the very state is in jeopardy. Now, Kursk got 1,000, 1,500, however many square kilometres you want to look. Did Kursk offensive in here realistically have any threat to the existence of the Russian Federation? No. That to me means it has not shown that it's crossed that red line. If it was in Moscow, maybe. Now, these critical government military sites of the Russian Federation, which could undermine nuclear forces attacks, remember about 3 months ago we saw a couple of drones fly into things like over-the-horizon early warning radars from Ukraine. We saw that twice in a week, and then it suddenly just stopped. I think there might have been some heavy words from America going, fucking don't do that. So I actually don't believe the existence of the state was threatened, at least from Kursk. Therefore, I don't think that red line has been crossed. If Putin believed his regime was in the point of total defeat, the Russians could resort to the use of nuclear weapons. When the Ukrainians complain that the Allies are scared of the idea of victory, they have a point. And this is the thing. What happens if there is a threat to the state there with victory? This war coming in the next months, year, whatever, it's going to be very interesting to see how this then all unfolds. Now, this is an interesting part in here too. The controversial concept, often attributed to Russia's doctrine, suggests that Russia may use a limited nuclear strike in a conventional conflict to force the adversary to de-escalate or to cease hostilities. Russian officials have denied that this is a formal part of their doctrine, and the interpretation remains debated among experts. So it's not in this part here that we actually showed then of the doctrine. But this is an interesting part here of the adversary to de-escalate. And this is what we spoke about. As imagine if Russia in here went, a lot of our civilians have been moved out. This is our territory in here. That's not, no one's, denying this. We can see the border. What happens if there is a nuclear strike here? Could America force Ukraine to de-escalate if they go, oh shit, he's not just talking? We don't know. You hear some philosophers talk about this may be the go for Russia. Of course, I'd never want to see one of these weapons used anywhere, but that is an interesting part if that's in doctrine as well. Maybe not formally, but it'd be interesting to see what the guys in the silos and those above actually think of the escalation, de-escalation of weapon systems like this, even very small yield, and how would that outwardly threaten the world? And like we've spoken about, of the US is not going to begin a World War III nuclear over Ukraine. And I've spoken that even if the Russians were banging on Kyiv's doorstep again, like they were in the beginning, there's not going to be a nuclear strike that threatens a return nuclear strike. This, I know people are going to be annoyed at me. America is not going to threaten the existence of their state, but LA, New York, whatever, over what's going on here. And I would even say if China came into Australia and was threatened, and realistic was threatened the state of Sydney, Melbourne, whatever, I still don't know if America would escalate to that, even if it's written in of you're meant to do it. And same with NATO Article 5. It'd be very interesting to see what the response would actually be, knowing that endo-worldo at that point. Legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day. If I don't speak to you tomorrow, have a great day tomorrow as well. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.